You're tuned into the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week I've got Jesse Green on with me. Originally with the Sacramento Kings, recently he switched over to the Pittsburgh Penguins as the Director of Performance and Sports Science. So we're going to get a little bit more in depth as to what it's like to go from NBA team to NHL and a whole bunch more. Be sure you subscribe to the channel and follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder, S-N-Y-D-E-R, and here we go. Well, welcome back to the Zelos podcast. You know, there aren't too many times where I hit the record button, or better yet, forget to hit the record button. This is one of those episodes. I just had 15 solid minutes of incredible content that only I have heard, no one else. So now we're going to hit record and get into it, because I got Jesse Green in the studio and he has a tremendous amount of great content to share. He's starting in Australia rules football, AFL, going to the Sacramento Kings via University of Louisville. We're going to get into that. And of course, finishing as Director of Performance and Sports Science with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So he's been throughout a whole bunch of sports, and we're diving right in. So Jesse, thanks for bearing with me, brother. Can you give me a synopsis of your journey from Brisbane to Pittsburgh?
No worries. And firstly, thanks for having me on, Rocky. Appreciate it. I think you're putting out a really valuable resource out there for the listeners in the industry. So appreciate that. But I think it'd probably be easiest if I go all the way back to the start. Australian boy, grew up in country South Australia. Went to boarding school in Adelaide and then went to Bond University on the Gold Coast for my undergraduate degree. That was a Bachelor of Sports Science back in 12 and 13, and then decided to stay on and do my honours research year. So that was a pretty cool project. I was able to utilize some pretty cool technology looking at palm cooling, or the cooling of glabrous skin surfaces, to try and maximize heat exchange, and how does that apply to work capacity or increasing work capacity in AFL or youth AFL players. So that was awesome. And then my supervisor of that honours project was also the Director of Sports Science at the Brisbane Lions at the time, and he asked if I'd like to come up and take an open position there that was more or less like a performance assistant across the board. So how many programs work in the AFL, and certainly how they did back then, is that they'll bring in many different students, whether they're honours or PhD students, to kind of create this symbiotic relationship between the team and the student, whereby the student helps the team by analysing the information and pushing back some interpretation and insights. And obviously the team helps the student by providing a platform for the data to be collected and so on. So I was lucky enough to be accepted into that role. It was a number of different capacities that I was exposed to. Nutrition, I was on the gym floor, I was helping out with the sports science side of things, return to play sessions, that kind of thing, which was really cool. Especially that it was kind of the sport that I grew up playing as well, and probably not the best participant, but I thought the next best thing was probably to work in that domain. So I was there for 3 years in a number of different capacities, especially that student kind of capacity. Also worked into an academy, a strength and conditioning coordinator role of the academy. So I got great exposure there to run my own program with the under 16s and the under 18s, boys and girls, which was awesome. And then kind of decided, being not only an Australian citizen, but a US citizen as well, I wanted to kind of expand my horizons a little bit and come over to the States and see what the industry was like over here. And again, try and get a bit more diverse in my experiences beyond the Australian industry. So applied for, I think it was about 50 jobs. I still have the folder on my desktop of all of those jobs that never landed. One did land, luckily, at the University of Louisville. So that was in 2017, moved over to Kentucky, which was a bit of a culture shock, going from sunny Brisbane to, I guess, sunny Kentucky sometimes, but that was a big change. And that was in a 50-50 role, half strength and conditioning and half sports science, working with a number of different sports. Mostly it was field hockey, women's basketball, baseball, a little bit of volleyball and a little bit of lacrosse, just multiple different sports, working with a really smart staff, really good group. Again, drinking out of a fire hose, as they say. Really good experience though. And then I was there for about 14 months. And then 2017, I think it was, late 2018, my manager at the time, Tina Murray, she moved on to the Sacramento Kings, gave me a phone call a couple of weeks later. And of course I said yes, and was on a plane to Sacramento. and that was starting in 2018, late 2018 as well. And was there for 4 seasons in a number of different capacities. Started off as pure sports science and then worked into more of a managerial role across strength and conditioning and sports science, which was awesome. And then September last year, 2022, moved over here to Pittsburgh in a similar role, Director of Performance and Sports Science, and here we are.
That's fabulous. We've had some previous guests on who have changed from one major sport to another, from football to basketball, or from hockey to basketball, and so on. But I don't know if we've gotten from basketball to hockey. I'm curious. Well, there's the obvious question: how do you feel about leaving Sacramento the season before they made it to the playoffs? So, are you okay with that? Are you a little bitter, or everything good?
Yeah, I wouldn't say bitter. It is a little, it's a little rubbing salt into the wound on your part, but that's okay. I'll let you go on that one.
Okay.
But nonetheless, super happy for those guys. I've still got a lot of friends there, both staff and players. So super happy for them, and no doubt they're at the beginning of something great.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, and hopefully Pittsburgh will be the same thing. Now, you mentioned University of Louisville. You had a 50-50 role, half of being sports science, the other performance. So obviously you developed a great deal of experience and knowledge there, and you transferred it over to Sacramento. But I'm sure there were some things that did not transfer, or some things that you needed to learn more about when landing with an NBA team. What might some of those things be?
Yeah, I think 2 things really come to mind. First is the caliber of athlete that you're dealing with. Obviously, there's thousands of basketball players in the NCAA Division I, but there's only a very small proportion of those players make it to the NBA. So firstly, the caliber of player that you're dealing with is certainly something that you have to adapt to. And then secondly is the schedule. I mean, the NBA schedule, as many people know, is brutal. Squeezing in physical development and development of key capacities, depending on what guys need, is a challenge. But to be able to kind of employ an agile periodization approach, or essentially just an approach where we can match certain stimuli around games, practices, and what have you, was certainly something I spent a lot of, more or less my first 2-3 years, really trying to figure out where we can squeeze these little stimuli in. And basketball as a culture as well, they don't take a ton of time off from playing basketball. A lot of them are straight back in the gym 2, 3, 4 weeks after their season finishes. So it's certainly a challenge, not only in season, but off season as well, squeezing in that physical development and finding those little windows where you can add that stimulus effectively.
And what kind of stimulus are we talking about? Like, are just training stimuli? Were there other elements that you wanted to try and kind of wedge in there, depending upon what the schedule was holding?
Yeah, so looking at the demands of the game, obviously there's a huge requirement for reactivity and elasticity as well. Muscular strength is essential to all sporting endeavors, I believe. So development of that as well. And I think when you look at the typical route of a very high level basketball player, I mean, they're playing and they're specializing very early in their AAU tournaments. They go into college for maybe 10 months, maybe 9 months, and then they come straight into the NBA at 20, 21 years old. So there's still a lot of physical development left on the table to be chased. It's just, again, it's a matter of fitting that in within the schedule where we play. On average, it was about 3.25 games a week. The most dense period was 5 games in 7 days. Least dense period is obviously in the off season. So trying to build a system around that density and around that fluctuating density of games and practices on top of that was a challenge, and certainly something that I've been building towards.
Well, I imagine even greater challenge too, to add to that, would be the individual player themselves. You've got very young athletes, you've got veterans, they have different perspectives or viewpoints on training. They have certain ways in which to do things, and their bodies are either in the course of developing or have pretty much developed and are trying to hold on to peak performance. How did you navigate that within your framework of agile periodization?
Yeah, I think it starts with a really comprehensive understanding of the demands of the sport. And that's my personal philosophy as well as a practitioner, is understand the demands of the sport as best as you possibly can, and then prepare for that. So if you work your way backwards from the sport, strength is important. Elasticity or reactive strength is important if we're talking about basketball players. Anaerobic capacity is really important, given the work to rest ratios that games provide. Range of motion at certain key joints is really important. Obviously, tendon issues are a key cause of games miss. So tendon health and ensuring the strength and integrity of tendons is really important. Ankle sprains, so working proprioceptively and key areas at the ankle. Just understanding the demands of the sport as best as you possibly can, and then reverse engineer, or essentially profile those demands or profile those qualities against what you've benchmarked or what you've deemed as perhaps a standard or perhaps a gold standard, whatever you'd like to call it. And then the program kind of builds itself off the back of that.
And so when it comes to the sports science, there's different elements within the science itself, different tools, shall we say, whether it's force plate technology, sleep monitoring, or fueling monitoring for that matter. What are the go-tos that you found yourself really relying on in the realm of sports science with your NBA players?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to any form of technology, it starts with a question. So we had questions of how strong is this athlete? How powerful is this athlete? How reactive is this athlete? What is the work to rest ratio of an NBA rotation, of an NBA quarter? All of these questions we needed to find answers to, and we've led our way to common technology. So to answer the question of how powerful, how strong, how reactively strong are they? Force plates are a really great option for that. They just happen to be the gold standard and reasonably affordable as well for a pro team. So we use the force plates a lot. In terms of answering questions about work to rest ratios and how do you quantify the work? What is the work? How do you quantify the rest? What is the rest? Player tracking can do that really, really well. So a local positioning system and a wearable device with an accelerometer, gyroscope, and a magnetometer was the answer to that, or the solution to help us answer that question. So I think that's where a lot of the technologies are born out of, is a question to try and determine, or a question-based approach to try and determine an answer to that.
And in regards to communicating with, partly the team of professionals, the staff members that you have, as well as to the athletes themselves, how do you take all that quantifiable data and filter it down into a conversation?
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that, because this is a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially now that I've transitioned sports. I think first and foremost, you have to know the audience that you're talking to. If it's a general manager, if it's a fellow strength and conditioning coach, if it's a PT or an AT, a head coach, a player, you have to modify that message, and you have to use language that they're familiar with to relay that message. That's the easiest way to get someone offside or to put a guard up right between you, is to use language that may seem incomprehensible to the other party, whoever you're talking to. And I think early on, it was a couple of years ago, I kind of stumbled across, it's got many names within the literature. It's actually born out of the business information system side of things. It's called the wisdom hierarchy. And it's kind of just an acronym of DIKW, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And kind of, if we can run through maybe an example of those kind of four elements of that hierarchy, is firstly, you have data. So if we use an example, a lot of people are using GPS to quantify external loads. So we do a session on the field, on the pitch, on the court, whatever that may be. We download that information. That's just data. It's, relatively speaking, it's quite useless. If we're just looking at a blank spreadsheet with just columns, rows, numbers, it doesn't really mean anything for us. It doesn't help us make any decisions, or it doesn't inform us. If we go down the hierarchy to information is now formatted, and it's a little bit of context is added. So now that we can a little bit better. So if we take that GPS example, maybe now we've combined all of the total distance accrued from every drill, and now we have a session list of the session total distances for each player. Okay, now we can start to understand that a little bit. So if we move from data, then to information, and then to knowledge, knowledge is now understanding how does that session relate to previous sessions or that same kind of session last week. If this was a match day -1 session, how does that compare to previous match day -1s? So now we have knowledge. There's more context has been added, much easier to understand. Now that's something a little bit more digestible. And then if we go to wisdom, wisdom is ultimately adding that human intuition or the coach's eye, as people say. Now, what do we do with that information now? So we've got the raw data. We've turned it to information by making it contextualized. It's now, we turned it to knowledge when we compare it to different elements of our program or different elements of that information. And then they finally have the wisdom, which is adding your coach's eye to say, okay, this session was much bigger than normal. We need to do X tomorrow. Or it's much less than normal. We need to do Y tomorrow. And that's kind of
love that.
A dichotomy.
I've never heard of that hierarchy before, but please tell me the name of it again.
So it's got many names within the literature. You can look it up. You'll find it if you research the wisdom hierarchy.
Wisdom hierarchy.
It's got many names. It's kind of got a few versions of it as well that add certain levels, but the 4 kind of common structures of that are of those 4 that I just covered there.
Okay, so within that hierarchy, how does it differ between your experience at the NBA and now after 1 full season with the Pittsburgh Penguins? Is it different?
Yeah, so I think the data does not change. The information stage doesn't change. We are collecting data. We are trying to turn that data into information. We should be trying to, go up those tiers of that hierarchy at all times. It's easy to collect data. Anyone can do that. It's pretty easy to make that information. I mean, we just need some basic analytical skills. Knowledge is where it becomes a little bit different, because in the NBA, by the end of my tenure there, we had 4 years of data, and I would know, okay, this game relative to past 4 years of games, this game was a big game. And then your wisdom becomes a little bit more specific, or a little bit more fine-tuned, if you will, because you have that bigger data set, you have that bigger database, and you've made decisions and you've documented those decisions in the past to know, okay, when this has happened in the past, we did this and we got this result. So we can turn that into wisdom a lot easier. Here in the NHL, this past year, my first season was the first year that we collected game data. So we have a lot of data. We've created some information or some structure around that data to make it information. We're starting to build our knowledge base around what a game of NHL hockey looks like. And then we're trying to turn that into wisdom to know, okay, this next season, if we see what we saw in game 30 or whatever it was this previous season, we're going to do X, because last year we didn't do X and we got this Y response. And so I think the difference being is obviously the size of the data set in first place, but also documenting the responses to the changes you make. A lot of really good practitioners that I've worked with in the past and still talk to this day are really good about documenting everything they do.
And when you speak of like game data, are we talking GPS or are there other elements?
Yeah, so in the NHL, we have a third-party optical tracking system as well as a wearable system that's, again, a third party. They're not our sensors. They're the sensors that belong to the NHL. We take that positional data and then we process that ourselves through similar algorithms as our practice information to get similar metrics so we can compare between practices and games.
And therefore you are really getting speed, AKA power, endurance, fatigue. Are there other elements that's other avenues or elements that it provides you, other insight or information?
Yeah, so we get really simple stuff like time on ice and time on ice per period, and then time per shift as well, which is really fascinating stuff. We also get, as you mentioned, we get distance, high-speed distances. The acceleration piece is something that we look quite closely at. Acceleration events, average acceleration across a game, a shift, a period, and so on. And then we also get deceleration and those kinds of things as well.
Is there I know there's no magic number to substitutions, but are you finding, even though you're 1 season in, so your wisdom is growing with every day, but in regards to the difference, obvious difference in NBA and NHL is that you got 5 guys on a court, 5 guys on the ice, but the substitution is so much more frequent in the NHL. Is there a magic number? Is there like a certain amount of minutes and seconds that a player should be out there before being subbed? Is it more subjective on the coach? Do you have any influence with that? What's that like?
Yeah, so that's completely coach driven. How he decides to shift the players. He's got 4 forward lines to roll through and 3 defensive pairs to roll through, and that's a massive part of coaching in the NHL. Is how you decide to rotate those lines, how you decide to switch and change. Maybe you move someone onto a different line or into a different pair. That's something that we do not control, but it's something that's certainly fascinating. And unfortunately, I don't have enough wisdom for you to tell you what that magic number may be, but it's certainly dependent, as I kind of alluded to earlier on our call here. It's all about the work to rest ratio. If we're looking about sustaining high intensity work, it's all about that work to rest ratio. And firstly, you have to identify what is rest and what is work. The easiest way to identify that across a game is you're on the bench, you're resting, you're on the ice, you're working. But we can go a little bit more granular than that. And we can look at, okay, when you're on the ice and you're on a 45-second shift, which is about the average time for a shift, how much of that is doing high intensity bursts? Quite frequently we see it's a 3 to 4 high intensity burst, and then you cruise for a few seconds. And then you might go battle someone in the corner, and then you cruise for a few seconds. Then you might be fighting someone at the front of the net for position, and then you might cruise, or you'll be skating in transition up the ice in forecheck. So within the actual work period, when you're on the ice, there's another set of work to rest ratios that we can operate from. And they really help us to inform conditioning and inform, again, understanding the demands as best as possible, and really inform the training that we can prepare for on that side.
Okay, you mentioned contact, and there's a tremendous amount of contact in both sports. One a little bit more aggressive, shall we say, but that's up for debate in some ways. But off ice and off court training, do you prepare the athletes in some way for that contact? Is there a part of their conditioning program that is involving, I'm not going to say grappling or MMA or anything like that, although that I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are kind of pursuing things like that. But is there things, obviously not during the resistance training, most likely, but that you put in there, that you're kind of banging bodies as a way of getting them accustomed to doing that in real game time?
Yeah, so during the season, it's something we definitely don't touch, given the amount of contact that they're getting from practices and games as it is. And recovering from that blunt force trauma is a challenge in and of itself. So we don't tend to do much of that at all, actually, during the season. And this being my first off season and starting the program for, creating macro cycles and mesocycles for our guys, similar to basketball, a lot of these players start skating and scrimmaging and playing small-sided games. They'll probably start within the next month or so. So there is a lot of that preparation on the ice that takes place, and there is a nice progression of contact that occurs with that as well. Now, if we're in a specific scenario, for example, a shoulder, an AC joint separation or something like that, then certainly in that RTP process, we'll take them through some contact progressions. A lot of that I learned in my time in the AFL is building contact progressions. We have certain progressions laid out: tumbling, rolling, pressing, that kind of thing. But in terms of the healthy athlete and the starter or anyone like that, not something we program. No.
Yeah, I'm just thinking like some colleagues and previous guests within the NFL, they are noticing that if you have contact well before, say, even the preseason, building up a thickness, a resiliency for impact and trauma, thickening of bones and tissue. So those that show up a little bit later to training camp, or maybe they're avoiding a lot of main contact, those are maybe the more likelihood of injury in those players because they haven't had that, we'll say, just micro trauma of conditioning. Okay, so back to the difference. I'm just curious. The major difference is when leaving Sacramento, coming to Pittsburgh, obviously familiarizing yourself with yet another sport. What things kind of stood out for you as more excitement from a career perspective, like, wow, this is great. I'm going to have the opportunity to do this or learn that. Anything that when landing in Pittsburgh, the back of your hair stood up with excitement from?
Yeah, I think firstly, the sheer excitement for me of learning a new sport and coming in knowing very, very little is something that makes me uncomfortable, but it's something that I love exposing myself to, is putting myself in those environments where I don't know as much about the sport, and you have to just dive right in and really read widely, speak widely, talk to as many people as you can, and really try to figure out this new problem that you're presenting yourself with. But secondary to that, probably back to my time in the AFL and having a number of friends working in the AFL and rugby as well, is just getting back to a quite a heavy contact sport was something I was really excited about as well. Because what happens a lot of the time, especially during the season, is uh, contact obviously is going to create a lot of blunt force trauma. It's going to create a lot more of those little kind of niggles, those little small injuries that aren't preventing you from playing, but they are, there's something that's there. You might have a little bit of pain from those or tightness, and that creates a lot of compensation up and down the chain, which creates a big flow-on effect of potentially an overuse injury elsewhere, or potentially some sort of compensation pattern that could result in another tissue being overloaded. So that presents a whole different challenge when, you might have this lift planned for this player. He comes in and he's just got absolutely crunched against the boards. Okay, we've got to go to plan B for this part of the lift and plan C for this part of the lift. And just being able to, again, be agile and try and, I guess, tailor your approach to the athlete of you is something that I think is an immense source of growth for my career, and an immense source of growth for any practitioner for that matter, is being able to have a solid system in place that on the fly you can say, okay, I wanted this rear foot elevated split squat, but he's got a banged up ankle from taking a puck at 90 miles an hour. We're going to have to go with a leg extension or something like that. And just having those challenges posed to you on a daily basis is a really immense source of growth, I've found. And then
go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, just to wrap up on that too, just the sport itself is fascinating to me. I mean, we're obviously on ice. We're not on a court. We're not on a field. We're not even dealing with normal gait. So that, again, is a massive challenge. And just the sheer speed of the game, you look at the shifting and how players and how teams shift, that part was extremely fascinating to me as well.
Oh, I can only imagine. So with your elements of performance, and maybe blending in sports science, what role do you play when it comes to return to play for those injured athletes getting back on the ice? What elements do you use, or what tools are you using in coordination with the medical and training staff, other ones?
Yeah, so that's probably one of the most important things we do as a health and performance staff or an integrated performance team, is that return to play process. And it's something I've really enjoyed in the past, and something that I've been able to do a lot more of in my role here with the Penguins. But I think it starts with, firstly, a really good understanding of the not only the athlete what they're dealing with, but the injury they're dealing with as well. And my role specifically within the return to play process is developing the objective measures that we're going to track over that RTP process, utilizing the best data we have available, whether it's in-house or out of house, or it's research-based, or it's something that we can talk to another expert in the field about. Finding the best objective measures that we can use to track progress in that athlete. If it's a hamstring strain, finding a test to use for that process, progressing that over time. If it's let's say it's a broken foot, using the force plates for some sort of rebound test or some sort of isometric strength test. Establishing the protocols, the reliability of those tests is something that I take the responsibility of that in that process. And then also, once they hit the ice, is that return to play. Well, I guess that once they return to skating, return to practice, return to play, return to performance. Mapping out that external load and internal load, for that matter, that progression back to the ice, using the game demands of what that athlete is normally exposed to on a weekly, monthly basis, depending on how long that RTP is.
And I imagine you have specific protocol or stages in which they can eventually graduate and they get clearance and they're back in play. Maybe not to the degree that they left the ice with, probably something that they are going to moderately progress back up to initially. But what is that moment in time? What are some of the markers, if you will, the indicators that they are ready to truly return?
Yeah, so I think to give you the generic answer, it depends. Obviously, it depends the caliber
Sure.
of the player. It depends how much time you have. Are we trying to get them back for a certain game or a certain moment of the season? But regardless, we're trying to expose the players before they return to gameplay, which is probably the most risky time. Is they've done their early phases. They've rebuilt some strength. They've rebuilt some resilience in the essential tissues. They've returned to skate. They've done their individual skating sessions. They've started to practice again, maybe non-contact. Now they're starting to practice fully with a little bit of contact, and then they start playing games. What we try to do is expose them to, we use a number of windows, but 5 days is what I've kind of landed on, is we try to, when they return to play, expose them to a similar cumulative 5-day window as what they would in a normal, or within the season when they were healthy. So within a 5-day period, you might accumulate random number. You might accumulate 1,000 load units. You might accumulate 50 high intensity accels, and you might accumulate 45 high intensity D cells or something like that, to say an arbitrary number. We want to make sure that we're getting as close to that as possible, if not overshooting that, to get them back to that, level, or that chronic load, if you will, to ensure that once they come back, they can stay back. Now, that being said, if this is a really high priority play and we've got to bring them back as soon as possible, then maybe that window of 5-day accumulation, maybe that slides into their gameplay. But that's just, I guess, the calculated risks or the calculated decisions that we as a staff, player included, everyone included, have to make and have to be on board with. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road on the RTP process, is when they really start to return to play.
Makes complete sense. Now, you have certain skills that are your strong suits, and perhaps, just like myself, there are skills that are not as strong. Can you give me an example of what you bring to the team that you are very strong with, and what areas are you looking to reinforce, to grow, develop a greater understanding or just experience with?
Yeah, so I think what I would love to develop myself in an area that I'm not as proficient in yet is, I think it's the deeper analytical skills of using the coding languages. It's something I've only just kind of started to dip my hands into, is using R, for example, or Python, whatever language that you choose to use, because kind of, again, what we spoke about earlier with the wisdom hierarchy is there's so much data out there right now, and a lot of the time it stays as data. And what I want to do is try and take some of that data and really bring that down the hierarchy and try and make sense of it a little bit more. And every year, the industry is pushing further and further and forward with more granular information. 10 hertz, 20 hertz, 1000 hertz, really high fidelity, high sample frequency information. And to process that information, to work with that information, the tools required are getting beyond Excel. They're getting beyond just Excel documents, because you'll break them very, very fast. So developing my skill set in that area is something I'm certainly looking to and continually developing with. And second to that, as well as leadership, is I have a staff here that I manage. It's only a small staff, but trying to become a better leader and a better manager is at the forefront as well.
And how do you do that? Are you, like, so many of us will stay within our industry when looking for continuing education, for more knowledge, and we'll be delving into biomechanics, corrective, velocity-based training, force plate technology, and so on. But you mentioned leadership. But do you go outside of that world? Are you taking like leadership courses, reading books upon it? How do you intend to improve upon that, other than just a day-to-day experience of trial and error?
Sure. Yeah, I think feedback is a gift. Always asking for feedback and ensuring that you're receiving feedback and receiving it correctly is important. But podcasts, YouTube, books, Twitter. I mean, the amount of resources out there and the information out there on any given topic is just so immense these days. I'm doing a lot of reading in my own time on leadership and how to better lead and to better manage, especially in this day and age. That's been primarily the kind of information I've been digesting on that, I would say.
Beautiful. So we're in the calendar year in terms of NHL. We're well before the season begins, and even before preseason, before training camp. Is this the time that you are delving into all that data, where you're trying to do some data mining and lower it down into the wisdom hierarchy? Or do you have enough time during the season to try and achieve that?
Yeah, so a model, or I guess a philosophy that I like to use personally is kind of a working fast and slow approach based on Dan Kahneman's book, Working Fast and Slow. But during the season, you're just working fast all the time. There's a practice, we need a practice report. There's a game, we need a game report. There's a lift, we need to prescribe these intensities and so on and so forth. So there's really little time for working slow, maybe a little bit of time here and there for working slow on the bigger projects that we're looking at over time, which is where the summer comes into it too. We're not concerned about games or practices or weekly loads or anything like that. We can start to delve into and dig deeper into some of the information that we have and try to better understand it. Because again, this data is quite novel, especially on the external load side of things in this organization. So trying to dig into that, make sense of it, trying to help educate not only our coaches, but our staff about what this means, how we can utilize it better during next season. That's something we're doing quite a bit of right now, is working on those slower projects.
Okay, and then assessing new team members as they're coming in. You've got some new athletes that have joined the team, and probably you're going to have some trades coming up, obviously, at the beginning of the season and through a certain amount of season. What is your role with the new athletes? Obviously, there's some assessments going on, but give us a general rundown of how you take a new player in and what do you do with them?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it, really. It's starting off with a really comprehensive assessment, both in the training room, whether it be a passive and active range of motion assessment, bring them into the weight room, movement assessment. We look at biodynamics, whether it's force, velocity, power, strength, looking at those qualities. From the bioenergetic side of things, anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, and aerobic capacity, really important qualities for hockey, ones that we try to assess. And then essentially, once we've built those out, or once we've assessed those qualities, profile those qualities against the benchmarks that we have. And those are moving targets at times as we build more information and we build more knowledge in this area, and then build a program out for them. And that's kind of where that's the starting point for any new athlete that comes in the building. And then from there, the onboarding process for us also includes introducing them to all of the resources that are available to that athlete, from a nutrition standpoint, sleep and recovery standpoint, mental health services, everything that we have, making sure that they're aware of the point person for those resources and that those resources exist and they're fully available to them.
I imagine, you'll just have to tell me, but I imagine you are somewhat of a puzzle master. You like solving puzzles and problems and are intrigued by aberrations or outliers. Those players that come in and present with this certain amount of quantifiable data via assessments, and you have a certain prediction based on the outcome of those assessments, and they excel beyond, or they are coming in as powerhouses and yet they are not performing to the level that the assessment is showing. Have you experienced that, whether it's at the University of Louisville, back to Brisbane, or Sacramento, for that matter, last season in Pittsburgh? Without naming names, obviously, are there athletes that you go, oh, this one's going to be a firehouse, and turns out to be just a small spark?
Yeah, 100%. I think both ways, it's and that's, I guess, part of the beauty of what we do. And that's what I get fired up about. It's, you have an athlete in front of you, you have a set of assessments, or you have a set of onboarding documents or onboarding processes, you take them through it, you build the program. And as I mentioned earlier, the best practitioners and some of the most effective programs I've seen have been derived off the back of really concise, really frequent documentation on everything that you're doing with the athlete. I think that is absolutely essential. And if the listeners take anything away from what I'm kind of speaking to here, it's that document everything you do, because when things go really, really well, you can go back and see maybe it could have been this, or it could have been this, or if things went really, really poorly, you can also go back and audit your own process. Is auditing your own process.
Yeah, and one thing that I've gotten out of our conversation too, to kind of circle back to your road to where you are, your career path and your knowledge path, if you will, is that you had teachers or mentors, you had people that you were seeking to be next to try to absorb knowledge, information from them. And not that you followed them, but they invited you along their journey. So whether it was University of Louisville over to Sacramento and now Pittsburgh, it seemed like you were following people. Is that what you'd recommend to others? Is to have yourself teachers, mentors, and be open to opportunity as it comes through?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I think mentorship is a really important part of the growth process, no matter what industry you're in, whether you're in economics, agriculture, or in the performance space that we are in. Finding a really good mentor, or a mentor that is not going to sugarcoat things, and a mentor that's going to tell you the truth and help you grow. And then it's up to you to receive that feedback and then take that as you would. But I think mentorship is especially important. And the book Mastery by Robert Greene is a really good book that covers all things mentorship. It's one of my favorites, actually. But that being said, I've certainly made a ton of mistakes in my career, a ton of mistakes. And it's, as long as you don't make them twice, as they say, you're in a better place. But certainly don't have it all figured out. And that's kind of what keeps me coming back to work every day, is trying to figure these things out.
Well, we don't gain experience from our successes. So, the mistakes are what causes growth. If you don't mind, could you share one of those mistakes that you learned the most from, if you don't mind?
Yeah, sure. I think if I go all the way back to my time as the strength and conditioning coordinator for the academy system way back when, back in, I think it was 2016 or 2017. And a young practitioner, just got out of uni, just got out of my honors program, thought I had it all figured out, and planned out the entire preseason. We did a 2K time trial for our aerobic capacity test, our fitness test. Did it at the start of the preseason and worked all the way through Christmas. 4 months later, at the midpoint of the preseason, we did another test. I'm like, oh, we've been working so hard. This is going to be the best test ever. This is going to be great. Everyone's going to be so much fitter. Planned it, at the end of a training block, right where I thought it should go. We did the test and there was no change across the board. And so I went back and audited my process, and I'm like, as I went back through, it was 3 mesocycles, so 3 months. And I planned the test at the peak week, or during the peak week of that 3rd mesocycle. So when fatigue was probably the highest it was in a 3-month period, 2017, Jesse decided to put the 2K time trial on that day. So that was a big learning opportunity for me. And I certainly will be planning a deload before doing any sort of performance testing going forward.
Well, that's phenomenal, though. That's great. I mean, it's just, again, just the perfect example of how we grow and how we learn. And you'll probably remember that for many times to come. So, Jesse, do you yourself, are there like internships or mentoring opportunities within the organization at Pittsburgh? I mean, we just brought up mentors themselves. So if there's someone perhaps interested, is there anything that's offered there?
Yeah, we have an in-season fellowship that we have that's quite comprehensive in terms of sports science, strength and conditioning, nutrition assistance, that kind of thing. We will open that within the next few months. So we're looking to get a really strong up-and-coming practitioner into that role as it comes through.
Excellent. You've already accepted applications, or are they still open?
We haven't opened the position yet. We should be opening that within the next probably 6 to 7 weeks, I would say.
Oh, there we go. Opportunity knocking for somebody out there. That's fabulous. And First, to finish off, because we're coming up against the clock here, I want to acknowledge the one of my mistakes here, and I'm hopefully learning in the future to hit the damn record button before we get going. But I really want to thank you for your patience with me and for your willingness to come on. I love this conversation. I get so much from every guest slash friend that comes on the show, and you are absolutely no exception to that. I appreciate it. I love the what you shared about transitioning from one sport to the other, from the world of academia to professionals. And if people were to want to follow your pursuits, do you post on Instagram? Is there social media sites or the website itself? How do people follow you?
Yeah, so not as active from a professional standpoint on Instagram. Twitter and LinkedIn are probably great places to reach me. Definitely more of a passive contributor, I would say, but certainly stay up to date and certainly use those platforms as a resource as well. So people can feel free to reach out. Would love to talk shop by all means. My LinkedIn, I think, is just Jesse Green, and then my Twitter is Jesse P. Green.
Okay. And do you do any public speaking, or you have any conferences or clinics that you'll be presenting at anytime soon?
Not anytime soon, not this summer, no. There was one originally I had planned, but that's eventually got pushed because of COVID, and then that eventually got cancelled. So nothing on the docket for this summer.
All right. Well, I'll keep my eyes open for that time when that does come, but I'll be in the audience, I hope. And Jesse, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I hope to have you back. Like after you've got your second season under your belt, hopefully you'll get a little cup under your Christmas tree, maybe we'll say June, in the form of Mr. Stanley. But yeah, I wish you nothing but success moving into the future, and good luck with season number 2.
Appreciate it, Rocky. Let's do it again soon.
And that's it for this episode of the Zelos podcast. All the thanks to Jesse and the Penguins, and for that matter, the Kings organization, for just sharing all the things that he came on and told us all about. We'll have him on again for sure as he gets a little bit more developed into the Penguins organization. I want to find out how he continues to learn in the role he's in. In the meantime, be sure to tune in every Monday, 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific, while we have phenomenal guests every week. Take care.